with a whole lot of truth. The Remedy Revolution is here for you. Ooh. And now here's your host, Aaron Page.
All interviews presented on the Remedy Revolution podcast are designed to provide information and inspiration only. Guests of the podcast may present opinions and anecdotes which are solely their own. And as always, before beginning any treatment protocol, please consult with your preferred medical provider. Welcome, everyone, to the Remedy Revolution podcast. My name is Erin, and today's guest is a board-certified psychiatrist and somebody who's been quite vocal over these last few years over at Dissident MD, dissidentmd.com. You can also find him on Instagram, X, and a Substack as well under the same name. He's written a book called United States of Fear: How America Fell Victim to Mass Delusional Psychosis. And he also runs a podcast with another friend of the show, Dr. Jeffrey Barkey, called Informed Dissent. And that is the intersection of healthcare and politics. I am very happy to have you on today, Dr. Mark McDonald. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Erin. Glad to be with you.
Absolutely. So I am, as we all are, noticing a very large increase in some of these mental health conditions, particularly anxiety from the last couple of years. Now, I know from my own personal experience that this has been a trauma for essentially everybody out there. We're talking about it's been traumatic regardless of where you fell on the spectrum of, wear a mask, don't wear a mask, take a vaccine, don't take a vaccine. It didn't really matter. The isolation and the difficulty that so many, particularly young people, faced was really detrimental to our psyches. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and kind of what brought you to this place of speaking out about it.
Well, what brought me to this place is very similar to where I am now. I'll explain. Just last week, one of my patients died. I had a 27-year-old patient who'd been seeing me for 10 years. He started when he was 17, still in high school. He was with me in therapy 3 to 4 days per week for over a year. And then 2 days a week for several years after that. He left my practice briefly, came back, went back into therapy once a week. I'd been seeing him regularly now for 2 or 3 years. He was also on medication management under my care. And more recently, I had been reducing his drugs and switching him over to supplements in conjunction with a good diet and exercise program, which he was able to accomplish because he was more emotionally available, more disciplined, and more responsible than he had been when he came first to see me in 2017. Well, last week, his mother, with whom he lives, and his father, here in Los Angeles, found him dead in his bed in his bedroom at their family home. He had, through a series of text exchanges confirmed by his parents, sought out and then purchased 10 pills that he believed to be Xanax from a dealer using an app on his phone and text messaging, which he then took back to his home and consumed one of. And we know this because the text messages were clear that he had purchased 10. In fact, went back to get 2 more because he only had 8 in the bottle, first of all. So he had 10. There were 9 pills in that bottle when his parents looked through his medicine cabinet, along with the police. They were unmarked, unstamped, clearly made outside of a pharmacy or a pharmaceutical corporation. They weren't even real drugs. They were street drugs. And they're being tested right now for fentanyl lacing. And I am 100% certain that they will come back as testing positive for fentanyl. This is the 3rd patient in my practice to have died since 2020. All 3 of fentanyl poisoning. Now, I say poisoning because it's not an overdose. These people are not attempting to get high. They're not looking for fentanyl. They're looking for something else, whether it's an Adderall stimulant to help them focus in school or an anxiolytic like Xanax to help them calm down. They're not drug addicts. They're not users. This is maybe the first time that they've ever even looked for street drugs or what they believe to be diverted pharmaceuticals from their friends who they believe are carrying prescriptions with them. And all 3 were dead, found dead in their homes by their parents of fentanyl overdoses. And all 3 of them were stable emotionally, well disciplined, good kids, none of whom were suicidal, none of whom were drug addicts. And all 3 of those deaths from 2020 now to 2024 were completely preventable and avoidable. And my concern is that given that I've been in practice now for 12 years, and I've never, as a pediatric psychiatrist, never had a patient die, not one time, since 2010 to 12, when I first opened my practice and went full-time, 2012. It started in 2020. And what happened, as you just indicated and pointed out, what happened in 2020? Well, we closed all of our schools. And in conjunction with that, we opened our borders. So those two decisions, which are ongoing in many places, schools are still restricted. There's still masks. There's still shot requirements. Parents are still not allowed on school grounds if they don't agree with the political views of the teachers and the teachers union and the principal and the local politics and politicians. And our borders are still open. We have now, I think, 7 to 9 million people who have come into our country illegally since 2020, many of whom are known terrorists, cartel members, sex traffickers, drug traffickers, God knows what else. And all of the fentanyl precursors are made in China. They're then assembled into fentanyl in Mexico, and then they come across the southern border through smuggling because we have essentially no border right now. These two government decisions, not natural disasters, not acts of God, government decisions to close schools and to open our borders, in my view, has led 100% to the skyrocketing increase in fentanyl deaths. And if you don't believe my anecdotal reports, just look at the CDC website that tracks fentanyl deaths over time. They were increasing. They had been steadily increasing slowly for about 20 to 30 years. But in 2020, between that 2019 to 2020 period, they shot up 30%. So year over year, at the end of 2020, there were 30% more deaths than there were in 2019. And now, in 2024, looking back, we have now 112,000 deaths in the United States from fentanyl poisoning, most of which were not suicides, not overdoses, just poisoning. Many of them now children. So I am right now, in this moment, very angry. I'm very sad. I feel very frustrated because we don't have the support of a government for children anymore, for both of the reasons I mentioned. And we don't have enough adequate information and education for parents on how to protect their kids from fentanyl. So this is a specific problem that I see in the United States today, which is related to what you mentioned earlier, which is the worsening physical and mental health status of our children. And it is 100% the fault of adults.
Yeah. Oh, gosh, my heart goes out to those families. And I think ultimately, which you didn't expressly say, but I think it's so important to understand that these kids are having massive mental health crises, anxiety and depression, and they are drawn to things that might be able to help, primarily too, because we haven't given them the tools to be able to handle those crises. And I'm not talking about just as parents, I'm talking about societal wide, even going back to, boys don't cry, or, just very simple mantras and things that don't allow us to be authentic and truly express ourselves in a way that feels safe and comfortable. And I know that, I'm sure dealing with lots of adolescents that you see some of that all the time. And that you are allowed to be a safe space for them. But not every parent and not every child has access to a psychologist or a psychiatrist to be able to have those safe discussions. So one of the things that you had talked quite a bit about on your Instagram was some of this rise in confusion when it comes to gender ideology. And something that I've noticed for a long period of time has been a significant increase of, all of these different, transgender ideology type of conversations happening in the autism world. And so I'm curious as to what it is that you have noticed in the autism population versus, say, the general population, and also in the population at large, given all of the propaganda that has surrounded some of that and really fueled the flame for that conversation to happen amongst our young people.
Well, I've been writing and speaking about this frequently on my Dissident MD Instagram account and also on my Dissident MD Substack, because it is, in my view, perhaps the most powerful unifying concern among Americans today. We have a lot of other concerns that divide us, but the transgender ideology, and I call it a transgender cult or transgender contagion, social contagion, is one that really does unify more Americans than any other issue. It is such a black and white and clear-cut evil that has taken our nation by storm and is causing only destruction and only injury and death that no thoughtful or rational American can abide by or support. I am particularly concerned about the victimization of children by the transgender lobby and the transgender ideology, the transgender cult/contagion, because children are already, in a way, emotionally immunocompromised for the reasons that you mentioned. They are already weak and have been weakened further in the last 4 years by having inadequate access to social and play activities, sports, the ability to move about and travel, to simply leave their homes. And they've been sequestered with cell phones, apps, social media that are algorithmically designed to reinforce certain behaviors and buying habits and patterns of thought that remodel the way that they see themselves and how they're perceived by others, and that create a very weak, very narcissistically driven level of immaturity. And that leads them to feel that they don't know who they are. In other words, their identity growth and development has been compromised. And what do you do when you go through pre-puberty, adolescence, young adulthood? You discover who you are. You become an adult man, an adult woman. It's been very difficult for young people to do that for the last 10 or 15 years, immeasurably more so in the last 4 years. So now we move into this confluence of weaknesses, the weakness of children who don't have a strong identity, and the weakness of families and institutions, and I would say just traditional common sense to protect them from victimization. And the victimizers now are the transgender lobbyists and the transgender ideologists who swoop in and they go after, through social media, through on-school programs, clubs, re-education camps, which is really what government schools have become now, to tell these poor children, especially young girls primarily, all of the problems you're having, your anxiety, your emotional difficulties, your struggle to find yourself, it's not due to the failures of adults to help keep you well or normal development or a combination of the two. You know what it's due to? It's due to you not actually being the sex that you are. And we're going to fix that by giving you a new pronoun, a new name, and even a new body by lopping off body parts and injecting you with hormones, chemically castrating you, mutilating you. And that's going to solve all your problems. And these kids just jump right on the bandwagon. And who jumps on the bandwagon more than anyone? Who's struggling to be found, identified with as a good person, liked, accepted? Autistic children. And it's the autistic children that are the most easily victimized by this. So this is why you're seeing this spike in self-identified transgender youth who are also diagnosed with autism. And this is so, I don't know any other word for it but evil, that I believe, my opinion is that the people who are involved in this should be arrested, they should be tried, and they should be, if convicted, put into prison for what they're doing to children. There is no justification, none, to allow any children to be brought into a transgender movement and to be used as political props for purposes of pandering for votes, gaining money or power, or furthering your research and clinic product. If you are a politician, a teacher, a clinician, a doctor, a surgeon, anyone, and you are supporting, promoting, or even condoning any of this in the pediatric community, you are a bad person, period.
You know, I feel like there's a larger umbrella here, and that has to do with this whole idea of affirming. And, you know, I think so often we get into this really brainwashed mind space of, well, we have to affirm everything our children want and desire. I don't know if that's come out of, you know, the whole trophy for everybody kind of mentality or where it has originated. But, you know, at the local high school, I'll give you an anecdote here. The local high school was having problems with teenagers who were identifying as animals, and they were literally eating off the floor. And the staff and the teachers at the school, instead of saying, no, that's inappropriate, you can't have those kinds of behaviors, would affirm that they created a space for these kids to eat off the floor, and in fact spoke to them in their preferred animal sound, whatever that might be. And I think back to, I'm well into my 40s now, but I think back to when I was in school, and if a child act like that in my high school, there would have been quite a different response, both from the staff as well as from their peers. And so this like radical acceptance of things that are, in my view, a mental illness, something that we should help these kids with, assist them in finding their identity and finding a space for belonging and community and all of the things that they haven't had, rather than just given a blanket affirmation for every single, delusion that they might feel they want to express in order to feel like they belong. Maybe you could speak a little bit to some of these other things that are kind of coming out of this.
Well, Erin, what you're pointing out is the end stage, the logical outcome, unavoidable, going over the cliff, catastrophic endpoint of pushing self-esteem over self-discipline and over achievement. Self-esteem is highly overvalued. Your ability to take care of yourself is far more important than how you feel about yourself. Because if you can take care of yourself, you will do things, you will achieve, you will succeed, and more importantly, you'll overcome your failures. And if you do both, then your self-esteem will naturally follow as a consequence of your achievement. You cannot build or develop self-esteem in children by lowering the bar and giving them things that they haven't earned, nor by colluding with them in what are clearly fantasies at best and expressions and symptoms of mental illness at worst. As an example, every parent would agree that if their child climbed up on the roof and said, Mommy, I'm magically a bird and I can fly and I'm about to jump off the roof, you would not affirm that belief. You would say, no, you're not. You cannot fly. Get off the roof. And if you don't get off the roof, I'm going to come up and I'm going to take you and carry you off. Every parent would agree with that. No exceptions. Why then are parents now being bullied into condoning and even promoting the belief, fantasy, mental illness, that their little girl is actually a boy and should be wearing boys' clothes, change her pronoun, change her name, and ultimately change her body medically in an irreparable way so that that little girl feels better about herself, at least temporarily. In other words, affirming that child's identity as the opposite sex, just like the little boy who's being affirmed or not affirmed, hopefully, in his identity as a bird. I don't see any difference. I really don't. And in fact, I would say that it's more likely that that little boy would be able to fly off the roof and land safely than it is for a little girl to physically become a boy, which has never happened in the history of humanity. So I don't believe that the way that parents are going about this is healthy or correct. And my suspicion is that most parents know in their hearts that the affirmation movement is wrong and destructive, just like they know in their hearts and can act on their feelings in their heart that affirming the child's desire to eat pizza and ice cream every night, which is what every child wants at some point, is also not healthy. And they don't do that either. So why are they doing it? And I believe it has to do with peer pressure and the fear of being attacked, criticized, castigated, called out, perhaps even in some cases being doxxed or exposed on social media, which could lead to problems in your career, being scolded or ostracized in your social community, or even perhaps your religious community. God knows where it ends. And this is why, and I've said this now frequently for the last 4 years, I've written about it in my first book, United States of Fear, back in 2021. The only antidote to this on the side of the parents is the expression of courage. And courage now, today, is nothing more than speaking the truth. It's nothing more than feeling some fear and anxiety and acting in spite of it, not despite, but in spite of it, and doing what's right. That's all it is. You don't have to be special. You don't have to be rich. You don't have to be famous or powerful. You can be a courageous adult by simply speaking the truth and acting well and correctly in spite of your fear. And if more parents would do this, this whole affirmation nonsense would end and we would save our children.
Absolutely. I think one of the best things that we could ever do for our children is to allow them to make mistakes, to allow them to fail. And I think what that whole, trophy movement, even back, 20 years ago or so has done has taken the word failure out of our children's vocabulary. And so when they try on different parts of their identity, they know that they're not going to fail. And, and so I feel like it's emboldened both the children as well as their parents in this era. And unfortunately, it's leading us down a very, very slippery slope in a lot of different ways. You mentioned or touched on it, but the medical implications of gender transitioning are not widely discussed, and they are, in fact, almost swept under the rug in most situations. Nobody wants to talk about the potential harms that we could be causing to these kids. I don't know if you have any experiences or anecdotal stories of different people who have really suffered from this. But, I think that's such a huge point that so many people just want to ignore for the sake of an ideology, which I don't understand that either, to be very frank with you.
Well, I think the evidence shows that the truth of the motivation of the transgender movement has nothing to do with protecting children. It has to do with harming them. And this is a core proposition and evident fact that needs to be addressed every time this discussion takes place, because as soon as we accept the premise that it is possibly good or possible even for a child to change his or her sex, we've already conceded the argument to the transgender lobby. In the same way that we conceded the argument 4 years ago that it's possible that there might be some good in forcing children to wear masks to protect themselves from a cold. Now, prior to 2020, we would never have accepted that proposition at all. We would have laughed it off and said, "Are you crazy? I'm not going to put a mask on my child's face. That's nuts." But because we weren't quick enough in pointing out the obvious ludicrousness of the whole proposition, we began to do it. And then we moved on to injecting them with toxins, these experimental, ultimately fake vaccines that are now proven to be fake and harmful and useless. And we've harmed our children physically from that medical misadventure. And we've done the same thing with the transgender movement. Instead of pushing back right away and saying, this is not even going to pass the BS test, the sniff test, it is not possible for a child to change his sex, no more is it possible for a child to fly, we're not going to put on fake wings on the child's arms just to see if maybe he'll have a soft landing when he jumps off the roof. Why not? Why not affirm him and see what happens? We shouldn't be doing that, and obviously we're not, but we are with the transgender movement. So in my view, there's been a kind of acceptance of a compromised immune system, both emotionally and physically, due to our adult foolishness of, as you said, avoiding the prospect of failure, and that's the sort of social emotional side, or on the other side, the physical one, the avoidance of getting infected with a common virus. And when we try to overprotect our children, when we try to prevent them from living their lives, which requires failure, it requires infection, it requires sickness, which is what strengthens us, just in the same way that if you go to the gym, you come back sore. Sometimes you have inflammation, sometimes you overexert yourself. But if you never go to the gym, if you sit in your chair all day long, what happens? Your body atrophies, decays, becomes obese. And as we've seen in the last few years, heart disease has skyrocketed, obesity, diabetes, et cetera. Is it because people took too many risks in going to the gym? Of course not. It's the opposite. We have to get out of this immature, foolish, silly, narcissistic, overprotective notion of the boy in the bubble as somehow this ideal to strive for. We know what happens with the boy in the bubble. We've seen that movie, literally that movie. After a few years, he comes out of the bubble, and what happens? His immune system doesn't exist. So the first minor little cold virus that gets into his nose causes him to die within about 2 or 3 days. Well, that's what we're doing to our children emotionally, socially, psychologically, and physically by pretending that we can protect them from life as if we should. Why do you want to protect yourself from life? Isn't life about pain, suffering, joy, loss? Dolly Parton was quoted recently, and I don't know when she said it, but she was quoted recently as saying, to enjoy and even see the rainbow, you have to suffer through the rain. Well, you can't get rainbows without rain. So if you ban the rain, you've now banned rainbows. And don't we all get through the rain eventually? Maybe we get a flat tire or we slip and fall, but we get through it and we enjoy the sunlight, which I'm enjoying now in LA after 3 days of rain. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't have that opportunity. It seems to me so simple and so obvious. And so I struggle sometimes with ways to convince and explain this to parents who have been, I think, really brainwashed by a cult that has lied to them and told them that if they don't protect their children from any form of suffering and pain, that they're bad parents. Well, the purpose of life, my philosophical position, the purpose of life, the goal of life is not to live the longest life possible and the safest life possible. It's to live the best life. And the best life is not necessarily safe. It certainly is never safe, and nor is it always long. A short, brief, unsafe, but full life is far preferable to a long life, even a long life, that is completely safe and devoid of meaning.
Absolutely. That's so well put. And I think leads, I'm sure, very well into the topic of your book, which is essentially fear and the last several years and what fear has done to so many people across the board. So young, old, it really didn't matter. And in fact, it didn't really matter what ideology you subscribed to. There was fear involved, regardless. Certainly, speaking for myself, despite the fact that I knew what things were going on very immediately, to be honest, I still, there was a level of fear, fear about somebody coming into my home, fear of repercussions for speaking out, fear of going into the grocery store without a mask on, all of those kinds of things. I certainly experienced fear throughout that whole process. And I'm sure many people, even with similar views, also experience fear. But I also believe that those of us who knew what the agenda was and understood what the agenda was, I've always said it's almost as if we are the people who have already dealt with our own mortality. We know that death is inevitable and we don't fear it. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the vast majority of people who got through all of this and understood what was happening came out on the other side with a more of a fearlessness in them versus those who, really listened to a lot of the messages that were being put out there. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that fear message and what that did to the population here.
That's an excellent point. I completely agree with you on both of your points that you just made. One being that those who are driven to act because of fear rather than despite it will inevitably not achieve a full life because their fear will then dictate their actions, and their actions will be hyper protective for themselves and those they care about, which will then cause them to sacrifice the opportunity and the possibility of growth, which can only come through misadventure, pain, and suffering. You don't grow by getting lucky or by dodging a bullet. That doesn't achieve growth. That preserves your physical being, but it doesn't allow you to grow and develop. And without that, I don't think there's any real reason to be alive. The reason to be alive is not just to continue living. That's kind of a circular argument, right? And secondly, I agree with your point that fear is a paralyzing and unduly influencing emotion when it's not checked, that suspends your rational faculties and then puts you in a compromised position to do things that are not in your best interests. And you mentioned a few and gave a few examples of how you felt afraid And perhaps there were days where you didn't go to the grocery store to buy food because you just weren't up to facing the fear that you would be castigated, attacked, thrown out. I mean, there were women who were physically assaulted and dragged out of supermarkets. I saw the videos because they went in to get some eggs and milk for their kids and they didn't have a mask on their face. And people surrounded them and started beating them up, dragging them out of the stores. So that's not an irrational fear. But when you live and act on that fear all the time and you can't overcome it ever, then you just become a recluse and then your life ends. So although I believe I properly identified the cause of the mental anguish and physical suffering that people went through starting in 2020 as a consequence of being driven by fear. I'll call fear sort of the fuel, the gasoline that powered this vehicle that took us all over a cliff. That's not enough to solve the problem, because even if you identify fear as being the culprit, as being the paralytic agent that keeps you from rational thought and from doing what's good and perhaps even acting courageously, you still need to find out and discover a way to get over it. And so after a couple of years, I decided to write a second book called Freedom from Fear, which was based on the notion, the metaphor, I guess you could say, that fear in the United States had become like an addiction. I walked past a woman, a young woman, probably a teenager, a couple of years ago, right before I wrote that second book, Freedom from Fear, who was wearing like a workout outfit. She was clearly young, healthy, energetic. And as she approached me on the street, it was dark that night, and I had this sense that she was afraid. And, you know, the typical fear is she's going to be physically assaulted or raped or mugged because there's a man, she's a young woman. But what she did was, rather than cross the street to avoid being physically assaulted, she walked right past me. But as she got about 10 to 15 feet away, as she was approaching me, she reached into her pocket and she grabbed a mask and put it on her face. And then as she passed me by about 15 feet beyond me, she took the mask off and put it in her pocket because I watched her as she passed. And I thought, now that just encapsulates everything that's wrong with our fear response. She may have had, should have had, to some degree, the right to feel physically afraid because I could have attacked her and harmed her physically. That's a rational fear. But she wasn't. She wasn't afraid of that at all. She was afraid of catching a cold. So I wrote this book, Freedom from Fear, on the basis of and inspired by the 12-step program from, Alcoholics Anonymous and Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, identifying the audience as the individual. The first book is really written about the country as a whole. It's speaking to Americans. This is speaking to you, the individual. And it goes through the 12 steps that I believe are an excellent method and way to overcome fear, just as you would overcome an addiction, like reaching in your pocket for a cigarette, or reaching into your pocket for a little flask of alcohol if you start to feel jumpy. Those are addictions, and they're involuntary actions to reach for those things. This woman didn't even think about the mask. She didn't stop and say, okay, what do I do to protect myself from a cold? Oh, I have a mask. No, she just involuntarily reached into her pocket, grabbed the mask, and put it on. It was a reflex. And a lot of addictions simply become reflexes over time, just like our fear responses have become almost reflexes since 2020, 2021. So the first thing that one needs to do, in my view, is acknowledge that one is afraid, just like you acknowledge that you're an alcoholic when you go to AA. And then you move through the program, step 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, doing things such as avoiding the dealer. If you go past a liquor store every day as an alcoholic, or a bar, you're probably going to get pulled in one day and have that one last drink, right? Well, if you're watching social media and even mainstream news all day long, which for over a year, every single day posted a running counter of total deaths from the virus, you're going to be afraid to leave your house. In the same way that if you had a running total every day posted and plastered over every social media page, mainstream news article, pop up on your phone that said 1,200,000 automobile deaths since 1992 and counting, eventually you would stop driving, right? What if we had the same thing with plane deaths? You wouldn't want to fly anymore. So you have to stop your exposure from these drug dealers, these fear-mongering informational media companies that keep telling you that you need to be afraid. It's like a cleanse. And if you do that, then you can sort of re-equilibrate your nervous system to what is normative and hopefully start to act in a more courageous way because your fear response will not be so reflexive. So I do think that there are ways to get beyond the fear, contagion that I think caused us to lose our minds. My subtitle of my first book was How America Fell Victim to a Mass Delusional Psychosis, and I think it has been a mass delusional psychosis that turned into an addiction. And now I think many Americans are still living in a kind of state of addiction turmoil from fear. And we have to overcome this, Aaron, because a nation that is paralyzed by fear, and just as an individual who's paralyzed by an addiction of any drug, cannot live a full life. It is not possible to succeed as an individual or as a nation when you're in fear and you're living in fear and you're acting in fear all the time. And here we are again, now 2024, and what do we hear? We hear that Contagion X is on the way, and we have to lock down all of our medical facilities and cede control of our government to the World Economic Forum, that we're about to die from climate catastrophe, and we have to stop drinking coffee because coffee causes CO2 eruptions. And the only people that can drink coffee are those that are in Davos, that are deciding that everyone else cannot eat coffee. I'm not making this stuff up. This just came out in the last few days from the WEF. So we're still subject to this fear-mongering. It's not over. You need to accept that and recognize that it's up to you, the individual, to immunize yourself against it, to fight back, and to act in spite of your fear. Because if you don't do that, you will be compromised. Your children will be compromised. You will not be able to lead a full and fulfilling life. And ultimately, I fear that our nation will become weaker and weaker and will be overtaken. And if the United States fails, the world fails.
So on that note, how do we assist others who perhaps have really fallen victim to this fear mantra? Because I know many of us do our best to speak truth, but I also know that when you're speaking truth, it often falls on deaf ears, particularly in those who have become so engulfed in fear. And so what is that in your mind? What are the best ways to approach that kind of a situation? You know, obviously many of our friends and family members and loved ones, you know, have gone down that path, and it's now the process of, I think, they are out of that extreme fight or flight response and perhaps a little bit more open to having some conversation around that. How would you recommend approaching that with somebody who really was entrenched in that fear?
So this is an excellent question that comes up almost every time I speak as Dissident MD. I call myself Dissident MD because literally, simply speaking a counter opinion to the mainstream narrative now renders you a dissident. You become ostracized from society. And the answer to that question, for me, is the first thing that you need to do is assess for curiosity in the other person. I believe it is a waste of time and even harmful to you to try to convince, argue, and persist to get your point across to someone who is entrenched in fear if that person is lacking in curiosity. Like the old adage goes, stop hitting your head against the wall. You won't break through the wall. You're only going to injure your head. And that's what a lot of people have tried, unfortunately, to do, is to smash through the brick wall with their skull. It's only going to hurt themselves. So if you can assess for curiosity, the presence of curiosity, no matter what the entrenched ideology is, means that that person is open to considering a different point of view. If that person cannot express any curiosity whatsoever, then there's no point in continuing the conversation. I was taught motivational interviewing when I was in medical school for smoking cessation. And one of the first points that was brought up in the educational seminar on how to conduct motivational interviewing was stop dumping data and threats and finger wagging at the smoker who comes into your office, because that person's not going to change his or her mind. He's simply going to become more entrenched in his position and become combative. The first thing that you do is when you notice that the person is smoking and you ask, do you smoke? Yes, I smoke a few packs a day. The first thing you ask is, have you noticed any problems that you've had with the smoking? Has it caused you any concerns? Not, I'm going to tell you why it's bad for you. And if that person says, no, I love smoking. I feel great. It wakes me up in the morning. It makes me clear and focused. And he could be hacking and coughing up blood at that point. But if he doesn't notice that in himself, if he thinks that that's not an issue, there's no point in continuing the conversation. On the other hand, if he says, you know, it's an interesting question. Doc, I thought you were going to tell me how bad smoking is. I'm so glad that you didn't just come off at me and tell me that go off at me and tell me that I'm some drug addict. But now that you mention it, I haven't been able to play soccer with my kids anymore because I keep having trouble breathing. Do you think that might have something to do with the tobacco? Well, yes, it does, Mr. Patient. As a matter of fact, why don't we look at your lungs and measure your oxygenation flow and see if it's changed from 5 years ago? And you do that and you show the numbers. He's like, wow, I've lost 80% of my lung capacity. No wonder I can't play with my kids. Do you think stopping smoking would help? Well, as a matter of fact, it would. 90% of lung incapacity is reversed after 6 months of smoking cessation. You mean even if I've been smoking for 10 years? Absolutely. You see how easy the conversation becomes. There's no argument. There's no badgering. There's no yelling. It's a give and take back and forth, and you become the ally of your patient to help him through his addiction. Well, this is what we need to do for these fear-mongered people. We don't need to tell them where it's at. We need to ask them questions. So how has it been for you? I'm just curious. You've been in your home now for 6 months. You haven't left. We're talking over Zoom right now. I haven't seen you in a couple of years. Has that been a problem for you? And if that person says, no, I love it. My kids and I, we just sit on the couch all day long and eat popcorn and watch movies, and we order on Amazon. We feel great. Well, then just say, oh, I'm so glad to hear that you're doing well. I'll speak to you later, and you hang up. But if she says, I really miss going out to the park. I wish I could get coffee with my friends outside. It's so hard for me to do that. Now you have an opening. And now you say, really, gosh, I feel so sorry for you. What's keeping you from going out and getting coffee? And then you start asking these questions and they start answering. That's the way, I believe, to helping people overcome their fear. Except that about 10 to 20% of the population within the fear group is a lost cause. If you can accept that, then you can work on those that are survivable. It's like triaging. It's like that war movie that won all the Academy Awards. The man that saved all the people up on the Hacksaw Ridge or wherever it was, he didn't go after and spend 8 hours trying to save a man that had lost all 4 limbs and had only 1 liter of blood left, and then it died anyway. He looked at the man, he prayed for him, and he moved on. And then he looked at the people who were really injured but probably could get through if they were helped, and he put on tourniquets, and he sent them in for surgical procedures, and he gave them oxygen, and he shot them up with stimulants to keep their heart beating, and all these people survived. But he could only do that by allowing for and accepting the fact that a few people out of those 20, 3 or 4, weren't going to make it and just moved on. We've got to allow for that loss. There are some people in our friend circle who are just simply lost causes. Family members, it's sad. Maybe they'll get over it eventually on their own, but until they do, just focus on the people that actually are potentially savable. And then you'll actually do yourself good, you'll do them good, and you won't harm yourself hitting your head against the walls that are simply, at least for now, completely immobile.
Absolutely. And I think that's, it's such an important point because, we don't, it's, the old adage of using the oxygen mask on yourself before providing assistance to others. We do that because it's necessary to preserve our own integrity, to preserve, like so many of us moms, especially, tend to overlook or ignore. But it's really important to make sure that we are protecting ourselves and not putting ourselves in that situation, because the more we feed into their fears, the more we become fearful ourselves. And so I do think that that's, hugely important. All right, Dr. McDonald, we have reached the very end of our session where we are going to ask 8 rapid fire questions. We ask these questions of every one of our guests just to kind of open up the conversation, get out of that, very logical conversation and get to know who you are as a human being. Are you ready?
Sure. I didn't really look at the questions beforehand. I scanned them, but I honestly don't even remember them at this point. So whatever comes out of my mouth is going to be more or less a free association.
That's perfect. All right. If you could choose only one natural remedy for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Somatic meditation. Accessible,
Wow.
free, safe, easy to learn, and completely portable.
I love it. I'm a huge fan of Dr. Joe Dispenza, who advocates for meditation on a daily basis. And I think it's absolutely amazing. So I love it. All right. Number 2, tell us something most people don't know about you.
My undergraduate degree is in Japanese history and language.
Interesting.
I was a linguist, not professionally, for many, many years. French, then Japanese, Spanish, And there are other languages that I've learned not to a level of mastery or expert. And I thoroughly believe that I would go into a language linguistics program, perhaps become a PhD in one of the languages and teach literature until I was in my certainly late 20s, maybe early 30s. And I didn't have a inkling or even an interest in science or medicine until later in life.
So interesting. My son is very into anime, so we listen to a lot of Japanese. Very cool. If I were to compile a playlist of happy music, what song would you suggest be added?
It's funny you say the word happy because I'm not a big happiness fan in the sense that I don't believe people should search for happiness. It's kind of like chasing a rainbow. I think happiness is the product of achievement and contentment. And I think contentment comes from equilibrium, balance, achievement. One of the pieces of music that I find brings me the most sense of balance and contentment is Bach's Goldberg Variations. And when I listen to that, it pulls me through a cycle of introspection, sadness, meditation, excitement, joy, celebration, and then ultimately at the end of listening to the 32 minutes of multiple variations of the same theme, a state of bliss, which I do not get ever from listening to so-called happy music. Like the song that came out a few years ago, Happy, I think was the name of the song.
Right.
Every time I watch that, I just think, what a bunch of crazy people. It didn't make me happy. It just made me kind of disgusted. So I have a paradoxical response to happy music. I think it actually makes me feel somewhat cynical. It's like it's like the old joke. I saw George Carlin at Herbst Theater in San Francisco decades ago. And George Carlin said something that stuck in my mind. This is back in the 80s, probably, maybe early 90s. He said, "Why do people always come up to you and say, 'Have a nice day'? Maybe I don't want to have a nice day. Maybe I want to have a shitty day. Just go take your have a nice day and shove it." Who are you to tell me to be happy?
Yeah, this is spoken like a true Stoic. Very, very good. All right. Dr. McDonald, what is your favorite guilty pleasure?
Sleeping too much. I tell my patients, you've got to sleep regularly and for 8 or 9 hours, but do not oversleep. I really, really fight the urge to oversleep because I love to simply be fully relaxed and without devices pinging and people trying to demand my attention. And yet I force myself to not do it every single day because I know that it leads to no good.
And what is the most influential book you've ever read?
That's an easy one. Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Short, beautifully written, eloquent, simple, and life-changing. The completely upending proposition that he places in this book, which is that especially, even more pertinent today than it was when it was written decades ago after World War II, from a man who lost his entire family in a concentration camp and should have been dead himself in one of the camps in Germany. The proposition that the only thing that really matters in your life is to develop a sense of meaning and purpose versus money, fame, rich, power, success, all of that stuff. To focus on that as the primordial orientation that we must always keep in mind, it challenges virtually everything that we've been taught in the United States in the last 20 to 40 years. I encourage anyone who has not read it to read it. Even if you don't believe or accept the philosophy, simply the narrative of his story is more than compelling. I couldn't put the book down until I finished reading it.
Nice. I actually don't think you're the first one to say that. There may have been somebody else who said that, but
I hope more people do because that means the book is becoming more popular. You can probably buy it for $4 or $5 used on Amazon or at a local bookstore. It's an excellent book. It's one of my favorites I've ever read, and I think it applies to every single living human.
Absolutely. It's something I read a long time ago, actually, but now that you mention it, I should probably dust it off and give it a reread. So
it doesn't hurt to read it multiple times at different stages in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. What does the word revolution mean to you?
Violence. I think of a revolution in the sense of the French Revolution. It always ends with violence. I don't believe in or support revolutions. I think that they are fallbacks to either a refinement or a rebuilding, and that they sometimes become by force somewhat of a kind of only way to solve a problem. But the issue that I have with them is that they always result in creating more problems that then have to be solved later. So when I hear revolution, I think violence, I think excess, abuse, and I think beheadings and executions and Marie Antoinette's head falling in a basket.
Oh man. All right. I'm a little afraid to ask you the next question. What does the word remedy mean to you?
To me, remedy is a softer word which is ingrained with, impregnated with solution and a goodness in the solution, meaning that it's a softer turn than a revolution, which I see as a destructive energy and a destructive force. A remedy is a way to maintain and retain what you have, but rid it of weakness and toxicity and poison and infection, without needing to kill the body, to kill the host, to save it.
And lastly, if you could impart one piece of wisdom onto our listeners, what would that be?
I finished my first book. I concluded my first book, United States of Fear, quoting Thoreau. And I believe that even more now than in 2020, this line that he wrote is pertinent and critical, absolutely critical for every American to emulate and to act on, which is think for yourself. If you do not, others will think for you, and they will not be thinking of you. I have no interest in convincing people to agree with me, to trust me, to support what I have to say. I couldn't care less. If I could succeed in one thing, it would be convincing everyone to start thinking for himself or herself. If we could do that, we would solve, again, not 100%, because you can't save everybody. We would solve about 80 to 90% of our current problems, because they are almost all the consequence of us as individuals, and then therefore as a nation, not thinking for ourselves and ceding that power to others who do not have our best interests at heart, and then allowing ourselves to be harmed by that nefarious group. That's my belief.
I think that's fantastic advice. Thank you, everybody, for listening today. If you would like to get in touch with Dr. Mark McDonald, please visit at Dissident MD on Instagram, dissidentmd.com, on all the things, Twitter, Substack.
You can watch me on Informed Dissent, the podcast with Dr. Jeff Barkey, available on all podcasting stations as well, Informed Dissent.
Wonderful. It has been such a pleasure, Dr. McDonald. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you all next time. Take care.
Bye-bye.
With hope as a guiding light, through darkest days we'll fight the night. With a whole lot of passion, with a whole lot of truth, Remedy Revolution is here for you.